The dog lunged the moment they opened the kennel door. 3 handlers went down. A decorated colonel called the animal a liability and scheduled him for removal. Then a nurse, walked in alone, no protective gear, no backup, and raised her hand in a gesture nobody on that base had seen in years. The dog froze, dropped to the floor, pressed his head against her knee, and didn't move. The room went dead silent. Because what Maya Whitmore just did wasn't something you learned in a hospital. It was something you learned in a combat zone. And if you want to know what happened next, what she was hiding, what that dog was protecting, and what one corrupt colonel tried to bury before anyone found out, stay with me until the end. Like this video, follow along, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The first thing people noticed about Maya Whitmore was that she moved quietly. Not in the way that shy people move, folding themselves into corners and apologizing for the space they take up. She moved quietly, the way someone moves when they've spent years in places where noise gets people killed. It wasn't something she performed. It wasn't something she even thought about anymore. It was just the way she walked into a room, steady, measured, eyes tracking the exits before she tracked the faces. Most of her colleagues at Harbor Ridge Veterans Medical Center didn't notice it. Or if they did, they filed it under personality quirk and moved on. She was the third shift nurse on Ward 7, the post-surgical recovery wing for veterans. She did her charting without complaint, managed pain medication schedules with the kind of precision that older nurses took years to develop, and had a habit of sitting with patients who couldn't sleep at 2 in the morning when the rest of the staff was at the desk scrolling their phones. Nobody asked why. Nobody needed to. She was good at the job. That was enough. What they didn't know, what she hadn't told anyone, not in her interview, not in her paperwork, not in 4 years of working those corridors, was that she'd been inside real field hospitals before Harbor Ridge ever hired her. Not as a visitor, not as a student on rotation. As a medic, working fast in conditions where the electricity cut out and the supply chain had already failed and the person bleeding in front of her didn't have the option of a second opinion. She kept that to herself. People asked different things of you once they knew. The expectations shifted, and not always in ways that helped the work. Harbor Ridge sat on the northeastern edge of Phoenix, close enough to the mountains that you could see them from the upper floor windows on clear mornings. It was a federal facility, funded through a veterans' health program that had survived 3 rounds of budget cuts by making itself indispensable to the military units stationed at the surrounding installations. It treated active duty personnel, veterans, and occasionally military working animals, the dogs and their handlers who passed through on rotation or were transferred there for specialized care after deployments. The Animal Rehabilitation Unit was a small operation tucked into the administrative annex behind the main building. 2 staff veterinarians, a small kennel, and a rotating team of handlers who came in from Garrison Prescott to work with dogs that were cycling out of service or recovering from physical or psychological injuries. It wasn't glamorous work. The unit was underfunded, understaffed, and it shared a parking lot with the laundry service, which meant the kennel dogs barked at the delivery trucks every morning at 6 and kept the third-floor patients awake. Maya had walked past the animal unit 100 times without thinking much about it. Until the morning she came in for her shift and found the hallway outside Ward 7 blocked by 3 people having an argument in lowered but very tense voices. She recognized 2 of them. Dr. Patricia Osei, the hospital's director of clinical services, small, efficient, always carrying a tablet she never seemed to put down. And beside her, a man in uniform whose rank insignia Maya clocked before she clocked his face, full colonel. The third person was a vet tech she'd seen around, young guy named Torres, who looked like he wanted to be somewhere else entirely. "Cannot keep that animal in this facility," the colonel was saying. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who was used to his statements being received as finalized decisions. 3 incidents in 2 weeks. We have staff filing incident reports. The incidents were minor, Osei said, in the tone she used when she was fighting for something she knew she'd probably lose. One handler was knocked down. He wasn't injured. He filed a report. He filed a report because he was startled. There's a difference between a dog being aggressive and a dog being reactive. With respect, Dr. Osei, the distinction doesn't matter at 0600 when your maintenance crew won't enter the annex. Torres caught Maya's eye as she approached the nurse's station. He gave her a microscopic look that communicated about 6 different things, none of them optimistic. She pulled his arm gently as she passed. "What's that about?" "Rook," he said quietly. She didn't know the name. "The K9 in the annex," Torres clarified. "Retired combat dog. He came in from garrison 6 weeks ago. He's been—" He paused, looking for the diplomatic word. "Difficult." "Difficult how?" "Bit through a kennel latch. Refused every handler. Knocked Sergeant Davies flat on his back without warning." He glanced toward the colonel. "Hale wants him put down or transferred out. Osei's been pushing back." Maya looked at the colonel again. Colonel Victor Hale. She'd seen him in the building a few times, but hadn't dealt with him directly. He had the bearing of someone who had spent his career making quick, clean decisions and then moving on before he had to watch the consequences. "What happens if he gets transferred?" she asked. Torres pressed his lips together. "If Garrison takes him back in that condition, best case, they keep him in isolation. Worst case—" He shook his head. "They don't have the resources to manage an unstable retired dog for long." She looked at the door to Ward 7. She had patience. She had charting. She had a full shift ahead of her and no business walking into someone else's problem. She clocked in and went to see her patients. She thought about it all morning, which was annoying. She had a post-op veteran named Garza who was having trouble with his pain management, and a 63-year-old retired infantry sergeant named Polk who refused to use his call button and kept trying to get up and walk on a hip replacement that was 48 hours old. These were the problems she was supposed to have. They were her problems. But during her break, she went around to the annex anyway. She told herself she was just going to look. The kennel area smelled the way kennels always do. Industrial cleaner fighting a losing battle against the reality of large animals in enclosed space. There were 4 runs in the current rotation. 3 of them held dogs that glanced up at her and went back to their business. The 4th was at the end of the row, partially blocked by a folding screen someone had placed there, probably to reduce the dog's visual stimulation. She moved the screen slightly and looked through the chain link. The dog inside was a Belgian Malinois, maybe 8 years old based on the gray starting to thread through the fur around his muzzle. He was sitting in the back corner of the run, completely still, which was not what she'd expected. The incident reports had described lunging, aggression, unpredictable bursts of energy. This dog was still. He was watching her with an expression that she recognized because she had seen it before, not on dogs, but on people. Specifically on people who had survived something terrible and were waiting, with very little hope, to find out if they were going to have to survive something else. His file was clipped to the outside of the run. She read it standing there. Rook. Belgian Malinois, male, 8 years, former military working dog, 3rd Infantry Division. 6 years of active service, 2 deployments, commended performance in 2 operational theaters. Handler. Sergeant Elias Carter, MOS 31, K, military working dog, handler. Status, handler transferred, reassigned, pending medical evaluation. She stopped at that line and read it again. Handler transferred, reassigned, pending medical evaluation. That was the kind of language that meant something had gone wrong, but nobody wanted to write it down plainly. Below that, in smaller notes from the vet staff, multiple failed handler introductions, refuses commands from new handlers, elevated cortisol indicators, possible PTSD, adjacent stress behaviors. She looked at the dog again. He looked back at her. His ears were up, but not forward, not threatening, just watching. She didn't say anything. She just stood there for a moment, and then she walked back around the screen, reattached it to its position, and went back to her patients. She came back the next morning before her shift. This time she pulled a chair up outside the screen and sat with a cup of bad coffee from the break room, and she read a patient chart she'd brought with her as though she were simply doing paperwork nearby. She didn't look directly at the run. She didn't talk. She just existed in the space. The dog was loud for the first 20 minutes. Not barking, a low, continuous sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a whine, the kind of vocalization that communicated profound discomfort at being uncertain about something. She kept reading her chart, or pretending to. After 40 minutes, the sound stopped. When she finally looked up, Rook was sitting 3 feet from the front of his run, watching her with the same careful expression as before. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back down at her chart. She went back every morning for 4 days. On the 5th morning, Torres appeared beside her with a look that was half respect and half nervousness. "You know Colonel Hale has a final decision meeting this afternoon." "I heard. He's going to recommend euthanasia or permanent isolation. Dr. Osei doesn't have enough to block it." Maya set her coffee on the floor. She stood up, which brought her close enough to the run that Rook could see her clearly. He stood too. His ears moved forward. She raised her right hand, fingers together, and held it at her shoulder with her palm facing inward, a gesture that meant settle in a language that was not spoken in words. Rook sat down. Torres made a sound beside her that was not quite a word. She lowered her hand. "Get Dr. Osei," she said. "I need to be in that meeting." Go. The meeting was in the administrative conference room on the 2nd floor, the one with the projector that never worked right, and the chairs that were slightly too low for the table. Hale was at the head. Osei was beside him, posture tight with controlled frustration. 2 officers from Garrison Prescott were at the far end of the table with folders open in front of them. Torres was there as a clinical witness. And Maya was seated halfway down the table in her scrubs, which was itself a statement she hadn't planned but couldn't quite bring herself to undo. Hale looked at her the way certain men look at things they didn't authorize, with the particular irritation of someone who believes the room is already clearly arranged and doesn't understand why additional elements keep appearing. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "you're Ward 7 nursing staff." "I am." "This is an animal management review." "I know." Osei cut in before he could continue. "Maya has been working with Rook this week. I asked her to provide a clinical observation." That wasn't entirely accurate, but Osei had clearly decided that accuracy was a secondary concern at this moment, and Maya respected that. Hale settled back in his chair. "You have 60 seconds. She didn't take 60 seconds. She took 6 minutes, and she did it without raising her voice. She described what she had observed, the dog's posture, his vocalizations, his reaction to her stillness compared to his reaction to direct approach. She described the hand signal and his response to it. She used the clinical language from the vet notes because she knew it, not because she was performing competence. She knew it because she had spent years in environments where understanding animal behavior under stress was not a secondary concern, but a life-relevant one. "He's not unstable," she said. "He's grieving. He lost his handler. He doesn't understand why. Every new person who comes in and tries to immediately assert control over him reads as a threat, not a partner. He's been trained to operate as part of a team. The team disappeared. That's not aggression. That's a dog who's waiting for something that doesn't come back." There was a silence. "With respect," one of the garrison officers said, a captain named Falk, according to the nameplate, "you're a nurse." "I am," she said, for the 2nd time in 10 minutes. "You're not a handler. You're not a veterinary professional. You're not qualified to make clinical judgments about military working animals." She looked at him steadily. "I made a clinical judgment this morning when I used a 31K hand signal and got a response from a dog who hasn't responded to anything in 6 weeks. You can weigh that however you want." "Where did you learn a 31K signal?" Falk said slowly. "Field rotation," she said, and the answer was true in the way that partial truths are true. It answered the question that was asked without answering the question he probably wanted to ask. Hale was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Your recommendation," he said. "Don't euthanize him. Give me 2 weeks on his rehabilitation protocol. Low stimulus sessions, trust-building structure, progressive reintroduction to command language. If he doesn't show measurable improvement," she paused, "then you can have your meeting." Hale looked at Osei. Osei looked at her tablet. The garrison officers looked at each other. 2 weeks, Hale said finally. "Under veterinary supervision. You report to Dr. Osei, not to the kennel staff, not to my office. If anything escalates, it won't." "Ms. Whitmore," he said with that particular flatness again, "I wasn't asking for your reassurance. I was telling you the terms." She nodded once. "Understood." She was already running session plans in her head before she left the room. But what she didn't account for was the talking. She should have. She'd worked in institutions long enough to know that the most dangerous thing in any closed environment wasn't the official hierarchy. It was the parallel one, the one that ran through break rooms and shift handoffs and the 5-minute spaces before meetings started. By the end of her first shift after the meeting, she'd overheard 3 separate conversations about her. Not arguments, just commentary offered in the casual tone that people use when they've already decided something and are simply announcing it. Just a nurse trying to play dog trainer. Hale only gave her the time because Ose was making noise. 2 weeks from now, she'll be back on her ward, and that dog will still be a liability. She didn't respond to any of it. That wasn't strategy. That was just the way she'd always operated, even before she learned to do it consciously. Responding to noise was usually how you created more noise. She filed it somewhere useful, not as injury, but as information, and kept going. The sessions with Rook were slow. Day 1, she sat outside the run for 45 minutes and let him adjust to her presence the way he'd adjusted before, except now she was the only person in the annex, which reduced the interference. He watched her the same way he always watched her. She watched him back. Day 2, she entered the run. This was the part that had made Torres visibly uncomfortable when she mentioned it. The protocol says, he'd started. I know what the protocol says. The bite risk is real, she agreed, and I'm going in anyway. You can document that I was informed of the risk. He had the look of someone who was going to document significantly more than that, but he didn't try to stop her. She entered the run slowly with her body turned 45 degrees, not confrontational, not retreating. She kept her hands visible. She didn't make eye contact immediately. She just moved to the far side of the run and sat on the ground, back against the wall, and waited. Rook back to the opposite corner. His weight shifted forward slightly, which she tracked without reacting to. But he didn't lunge. He didn't vocalize. He stood there, tense and uncertain, doing the same calculation she was doing. What is this? What does it mean? Is this safe? She sat there for 25 minutes and then stood, turned, and left. Day 3. She was in the run for 30 minutes. Rook spent the last 7 of them within 4 feet of her without being directed there. When she rose to leave, he took 2 steps forward and stopped. She didn't make a big deal of it. Torres, watching from outside, made a very small sound that might have been the beginning of the word incredible before he shut it down. She wrote her daily report in plain language and filed it with Dr. Ose. Subject showing progressive decrease in defensive posturing, proximity tolerance increasing, no aggressive responses during session. She didn't editorialize. The numbers would do it for her. 8 days in, something changed. She'd been running light command language, not full handler protocol, just fragments, the kind of structural signals that establish rhythm and expectation without demanding immediate compliance. The point wasn't obedience. The point was familiarity. She was reminding him that the world had a language he knew, and she knew it too. He started responding to the settle gesture reliably on day 6. On day 7, he responded to the directional cues she used when she wanted him to shift position. On day 8, he responded to a recall signal she hadn't used since her second deployment, a specific hand movement that wasn't in the standard civilian or training center protocol. It was field adapted, the kind of shorthand that got developed inside actual units where speed mattered more than textbook form. When he responded to that one, she went still for a moment, because that signal had a specific origin. She'd learned it from a handler named Warren, who'd picked it up from the handler before him, who had developed it on a deployment that Maya had been part of. It wasn't widely used. It wasn't in any manual. It was the kind of institutional knowledge that traveled with specific units through specific theaters of operation. She looked at the dog. Rook looked back at her with that same careful, waiting expression. She pulled his file that afternoon and found the service record section she hadn't read all the way through before. Rook's operational history. 2 deployments, 3rd Infantry Division. Theater of operations listed as restricted. Handler noted as Sergeant Elias Carter. She stared at the name for longer than she intended. Elias Carter. She knew that name. Not well. She'd never served in the same direct unit, never worked alongside him, but in the way that people who have moved through the same narrow corridors of a particular kind of work know each other by reputation and by the second-hand stories that circulate. Carter had a reputation for being exceptional with his animals. Careful, patient, precise. Exactly the kind of handler who would teach his dog a field-adapted signal that wasn't in any textbook. She flipped to the last page of the file. Handler status, reassigned pending medical evaluation. No further information. She sat with that for a moment, and then she went and found Torres in the vet office. "Rook's handler," she said. "Sergeant Carter. Do you know what happened to him?" Torres looked up from his desk. Something shifted in his expression, something cautious and careful. "Why are you asking?" "Because I think Rook's behavioral profile isn't just loss of handler response," she said. "I think something specific happened, something he was there for, and I need to know what it was if I'm going to complete this protocol." Torres was quiet for a moment. "That information isn't in my access level." "I know. I'm asking if you know anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. "I heard," he said carefully, "that Carter went MIA during a training exercise about 4 months ago. That's what I heard. Unverified. MIA." She kept her face still. "Thanks," she said, and walked out. She was 3 corridors away before she let herself process it. Not Carter specifically. She hadn't known him well enough for it to land as personal grief, but the shape of it. A handler goes missing. His dog comes back alone, or nearly alone, carrying the last 4 months in his body like shrapnel that doesn't show up on an X-ray. And then the dog gets labeled unstable, dangerous, liability, and a colonel in a clean office starts scheduling meetings to discuss his disposal. She thought about the signal Rook had responded to, the field-adapted one that connected to Carter's unit, and the way knowledge moved through those operational chains. She thought about what that meant, and then her pager went off. Ward 7, Garza's vitals were flagging, and she ran him. The crisis with Garza took 4 hours and ended well, which was the best thing that had happened all week. By the time she got back to the annex at the end of her shift, it was past 9 at night, and the building was mostly quiet. She was almost to the kennel door when she heard voices, not the administrative kind, lower, the kind of voices people use when they want the conversation to stay between them. She stopped outside the door and listened without making a decision about it, just an instinct, practiced into something that operated below the level of thought. "Review is in 6 days, Hale's voice. "I want the discharge paperwork ready to move regardless of what Osei's nurse presents." "Sir, if she shows measurable improvement," I said regardless. A pause. "There's a reason the Carter case is flagged. This animal was part of an operation that has paperwork I don't want opened. His continued presence in this facility creates exposure." Silence. "The euthanasia option doesn't require a board review," Hale continued. "If the dog has a behavioral incident before the end of the assessment window, sir, are you... I'm telling you what the paperwork requirements are for each outcome. That's all I'm doing." Another silence, longer this time. "Understood, sir." Footsteps, moving away from the door toward the administrative corridor. Maya stood in the hallway and didn't move for a full 30 seconds. Then she pushed through the kennel door and walked to Rook's run. He was on his feet immediately when she entered, ears forward, reading her the same way he always did. She crouched down to his level and held his gaze. He pressed his nose briefly against the chain link and then stepped back. "I know," she said quietly. She straightened up and pulled out her phone. She opened a notes app and began typing, slowly and precisely, everything she had just heard, the time, the location, the exact words, as close to verbatim as she could reconstruct them. She added details about the file, Carter's missing status, the reference to flagged paperwork and operational exposure. She was not going to let this disappear. She looked at Rook one more time before she left. He was watching the door she'd come through, alert, still, focused, like a dog who'd been waiting a long time for someone to finally pay attention to the right thing. She didn't sleep much that night, not because of anxiety exactly, more because her brain had shifted into a mode she recognized from years ago, that particular kind of operational alertness where your mind keeps sorting information even when you've told it to stop, cataloging what you know and what you don't know, and what the gap between those two things is going to cost you. What she knew, Hale wanted Rook gone before the assessment window closed. He He'd said the word paperwork twice in 30 seconds, which was not the word a man uses when he's talking about a dog. He was talking about something the dog represented, something connected to Carter's disappearance and whatever operation had ended with a handler going MIA and a K9 coming back alone and traumatized. What she didn't know, everything else. She got up at 4:30, made coffee she didn't taste, and sat at her kitchen table with her phone and a yellow legal pad. She wrote out a timeline. Rook's arrival at Harbor Ridge 6 weeks ago. Carter's disappearance, Torres had said, approximately 4 months prior. The behavioral incidents. Hale's first request for discharge paperwork. The meeting she'd been allowed into. The conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. The gap between Carter's disappearance and Rook's arrival was significant. 2 months where the dog was presumably somewhere else. In that window, either someone had been managing him or nobody had. The file hadn't said. She circled reassigned pending medical evaluation on her notepad and drew a line from it to MIA and stared at the line for a while. Then she got dressed and drove to Harbor Ridge 2 hours before her shift started. Torres arrived at 7:15 to find her already in the kennel. He stopped in the doorway with his coffee and looked at her and then at Rook, who was lying 3 feet from where Maya sat on the floor of the run, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him, though she wasn't. "You're here early," Torres said. "I need access to something," she said, without looking up. "Rook's operational file, not the medical summary, the full service record." He was quiet for a moment. "That's restricted." "I know. I can't pull restricted files, Maya." "I'm not asking you to pull them. I'm asking if you know who can." She finally looked up. "Something is wrong with this picture. Hale's review is in 6 days, and last night I heard him tell someone to have discharge paperwork ready regardless of outcome." He used the word regardless. Torres set his coffee down on the supply shelf. "You heard him say that?" "I did." "Where?" "Outside this door. He didn't know I was there." Torres was quiet for another moment, longer this time. He had the look of someone running a private calculation, the kind where the variables include his job, his conscience, and his ability to sleep afterward. She'd seen that look before. On people who were good but not yet certain that being good was worth the specific cost being asked of them. "There's a liaison officer," he said finally, "at Garrison Prescott, Captain Navarro. She's the one who processed Rook's transfer here. If there's a full operational record, she'd have access." "How do I reach her?" "You don't, not directly. She'd have to be contacted through official channels." He picked up his coffee again. "But she has an office hour on Thursdays for facility coordination. She comes here, usually 9 to 11. Today was Thursday." "Thank you," Maya said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Be careful," he said. And then more quietly, "Whatever Carter was involved in, it got flagged at the command level. That doesn't happen with routine operations." She nodded and turned back to Rook. He had his chin resting on his front paws and was watching her with patient, dark eyes. She thought about a dog spending 4 months somewhere between his handler's disappearance and his arrival at this facility. The places that gap might represent, the things it might have held. "I know," she said again, which was not entirely true, but felt like the right thing to say. Captain Navarro arrived at 9:07 with a canvas bag over one shoulder and the manner of someone who managed too many facilities to be sentimental about any of them. She was in her late 30s, brisk in the way that competent people under-resourced get brisk, and she spent the first 40 minutes of her coordination visit in a meeting with Dr. Osei's deputy that Maya wasn't in. Maya waited in the hallway outside the administrative wing with a chart she wasn't reading. When Navarro came out, Maya stood and introduced herself directly. She'd learned a long time ago that the approach that works with people like Navarro is not an indirect one. These were people who had too many indirect conversations a day. Directness registered as respect. "I'm the nurse running Rook's behavioral assessment," Maya said. "I have 6 days left on the evaluation window. I need to understand something about his operational history to complete it accurately." Navarro looked at her with the neutral, measuring expression of someone who has been approached in hallways before. "What specifically?" "The timeline between Sergeant Carter's incident and Rook's transfer. There are 2 months unaccounted for in the medical summary I have access to." His behavioral profile suggests something happened in that window that I'm not seeing in the documentation. Navarro's expression didn't change much, just a small tightening around the eyes. You have full access to the transfer summary. I have the summary. I'm asking about what's behind it. That information is restricted at the operational level. Captain, Maya kept her voice even. I have a dog who responds to field-adapted hand signals from Carter's unit that aren't in any published protocol. He's been flagged for euthanasia on the basis of a behavioral assessment that I believe is incomplete. If there's information about what he experienced that would change that picture, I need it. Not for my purposes. For his. Navarro was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to become meaningful. Then she said, "Come to the coordination office at 11. I'll see what I can share within my authorization level." She walked away without waiting for acknowledgement. Maya let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and went back to check on Garza. The 11 o'clock meeting lasted 22 minutes. Navarro gave her 3 things. First, Rook had been held at a forward support installation for approximately 9 weeks following the incident that took Carter off the field. He'd been managed by a rotating roster of handlers, none of whom he'd responded to, which was documented but not flagged as significant, because nobody at that installation had the expertise to identify it as significant. Second, Carter's status had been upgraded from MYA to status unresolved, pending further review, which was military language for a situation that hadn't been closed because the circumstances hadn't been fully established. Third, and most carefully, the operation Carter had been part of when he disappeared was classified at a level Navarro couldn't speak to directly. What she could say was that it had involved facility security assessment and that Rook had been Carter's working partner on that assignment. Facility security assessment, Maya repeated. That's what I can share. Was it this facility? Navarro looked at her steadily. I've shared what I can share, which was not a no. Maya drove back to Harbor Ridge with the windows down despite the October heat because she needed air moving to help her think. Facility security assessment, this facility, or one like it. Rook trained to identify threats to a specific environment. Handler disappears during that assessment. Dog comes back carrying something nobody wanted to examine closely. She thought about what Hale had said. His continued presence in this facility creates exposure, not behavioral exposure, not liability exposure, operational exposure. She thought about that all the way back to the hospital, and then she went to find Dr. Osei. Odds. Osei listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Maya had come to respect about her. Some administrators listened with the goal of finding the moment they could redirect you. Osei actually listened. When Maya finished, Osei was quiet for a moment. Outside her office window, the parking lot shimmered with midday heat. A delivery truck from the laundry service was pulling out, and somewhere in the annex, one of the other dogs barked twice at the engine noise. You're describing a situation, Osei said carefully, in which the person responsible for this facility's command structure may have a conflict of interest in Rook's evaluation. Yes. And you're suggesting that the behavioral incidents that justified the evaluation may have been mischaracterized. I'm suggesting they weren't characterized at all. They were documented as incidents without any attempt to understand what prompted them. That's not the same thing. Osei turned her tablet over in her hands, a gesture Maya had started to recognize as her version of thinking out loud. If I escalate this internally, it goes to Hale. I know. If it goes to Hale, the review window doesn't change. The outcome doesn't change. He has the administrative authority to override a clinical recommendation. Then it can't be internal, Maya said. Osei looked at her directly. You're asking me to go outside this facility with a complaint about the facility commander. I'm asking you to consider it. Another silence. Osei's jaw tightened slightly. Give me until tomorrow morning, she said. And Maya, don't push Hale's people in the meantime. Don't give them a behavioral incident to document. Maya nodded. She understood what that meant. Don't give them what they're looking for. She was careful. She ran her afternoon session with Rook and kept it short and low stimulus, deliberately understated, nothing that could be written up as a provocation or an escalation. She charted everything she'd done and filed it with OC's office at the end of the day. She went home. She ate something she didn't taste. She slept 4 hours. The incident happened the next morning at 6:42. She was 20 minutes from the hospital when her phone buzzed with a text from Torres. Something happened. Come to the annex now. She pushed the speed limit getting there. The annex door was propped open. Inside, the kennel was in a different kind of quiet than usual. The 2 other resident dogs were pressed to the backs of their runs, low and still, which was not their normal morning behavior. Torres was standing outside Rook's Run with a garrison officer Maya didn't recognize, and a member of the facility's security team, a stocky man named Walsh, who worked the administrative corridor. Rook was at the front of his run, not lunging, not vocalizing, but locked on something. Rigid, alert, focused in the direction of the building's HVAC access corridor that ran adjacent to the annex wall. Maya looked at the wall. She looked at the dog. She looked at Walsh. When did he start? She asked. About 20 minutes ago, Torres said. His voice was tight. He hasn't stopped. Has anyone checked the access corridor? Walsh and the garrison officer exchanged a look. It's a HVAC utility space, Walsh said. Nobody's in there. Rook isn't reacting to nobody, she said. He's on a target. Ms. Whitmore. He was a facility security dog. She said it directly, looking at Walsh. That's what the operational record says. Facility security. He was trained to identify threats in enclosed spaces. What is he doing right now? Another exchange of looks. She could see Walsh calculating whether it was more work to listen to her or to explain later why he didn't. I'll get maintenance to check the corridor, he said, which was progress. She turned to the garrison officer. Get your supervisor on the phone. Right now. Tell them you have a retired MWD with an active threat alert behavior and no handler on site to assess it. I'm not authorized to... Then find someone who is. She said it without raising her voice. Because if there's something in that corridor and we miss it because nobody made a phone call, I don't want to be in the room when we explain why. The officer went for his radio. She went into Rook's Run. He didn't look at her immediately. He was still locked on the wall. That full-body rigidity that meant everything in his training was firing at once. She crouched beside him and didn't touch him, just positioned herself in his sight line and waited until his eyes tracked briefly to her face. She made the hold signal, slow, deliberate. He held. Still focused on the wall, but responsive, still working. Good, she said quietly. I hear you. The maintenance team found the breach in the access corridor at 7:15, a section of ducting that had been forced from the outside recently with what the facility's supervisor described as a tool mark pattern, consistent with deliberate entry rather than mechanical failure. Inside the adjacent corridor, they found a cellular booster device zip-tied to the support strut above the HVAC intake for the medical records wing. It was still active. The facility's security lead was on the phone with someone within 3 minutes. Not Hale. Someone else. The kind of someone that you call when you have a situation that is not a facilities management issue. By 8 o'clock, there were 2 vehicles in the parking lot that hadn't been there the night before. Plain-colored. Federal plates. Maya stood at the annex window and watched them pull in, and she thought about Rook behind her, still at his position, still working even though nobody had asked him to, still doing the job he'd been trained for because that was the only language he had left to speak. She thought about Hale's voice in the hallway. His continued presence creates exposure. She thought, yes, that's exactly right. A man in civilian clothes and a building ID she didn't recognize walked through the annex door and looked directly at her. He had the posture of someone who didn't need a uniform to make clear what he was. You're Whitmore, he said. I am. You were first on scene with the dog? I was the one who said to check the corridor. He studied her for a moment, not the way Hale studied her, not with dismissal, but with the particular attention of someone running a quick and thorough assessment. Then he said, We're going to need to talk about your background. Behind her, Rook finally moved. She heard him shift his weight, heard the click of his nails on the kennel floor as he turned away from the wall. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the man in the doorway. I figured, she said. His name was Decker. He didn't offer a first name, and she didn't ask. He had a badge that identified him as DOD Inspector General's office, which told her something about the scale of what was happening and also about why Hale hadn't been the first call anyone made when the device turned up in the HVAC corridor. The IG didn't get involved in facilities maintenance disputes. They got involved when the chain of command itself was the problem. Decker walked her out of the annex and into the small coordination room that Navarro used on her Thursday visits, which was now apparently available because nobody had told Decker it wasn't his to use. He closed the door, set a recording device on the table without asking her permission, and said, "Start from the beginning. Your background, your involvement with the dog, what you heard outside the kennel 2 nights ago, all of it." She started from the beginning. She gave him the Army years first, enlistment at 19, combat medic training, 2 deployments, the specific operational context she'd been embedded in, and the MWD units she'd worked alongside. She told it plainly, without the kind of selective editing she'd been applying for 4 years at Harbor Ridge. It felt strange to say it out loud in a room that wasn't a recruiter's office or a VA processing center. Strange in the way that things feel when you've kept them in a particular internal compartment for long enough that taking them out requires something close to physical effort. Decker listened without expression. When she finished the background section, he said, "Why didn't you disclose the military service in your hospital employment file?" "I disclosed it. It's in my records. I didn't volunteer the specifics of my operational experience because it wasn't relevant to the nursing role I applied for. It was relevant to this situation. This situation didn't exist when I applied for the job." He made a note. She couldn't tell if it was a mark against her or simply a mark. "Continue." She continued. She told him about the kennel visits, the response to the hand signals, the meeting with Hale, the things she'd overheard. She told it in sequence, without interpretation, just the events in the order they had happened, and she kept her voice level the way she'd kept it level through worse things than this. When she finished, Decker was quiet for a moment. Then, "The device in the HVAC corridor. You believe Rook alerted on it." "I don't believe it. I observed it. He was locked on the access point to that corridor for 20 minutes before anyone checked. His alert behavior matched documented facility security response protocol for MWD units, sustained focused attention, no auditory warning, directional lock on a specific point. That's not a distressed animal acting out. That's a trained dog doing his job. He's been listed as behaviorally compromised. He's been listed as behaviorally compromised by people who didn't know what they were looking at." Decker studied her for a moment. "You have strong opinions about the evaluation process." "I have direct observations," she said. "You can call them opinions if you want." The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement that she'd made a reasonable point, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "The device," he said, "is an encrypted cellular relay, the kind used to capture and retransmit data from systems that aren't externally networked. The medical records wing, it was positioned above stores, personnel files for active duty, and veterans currently receiving care at this facility." She processed that. Someone was pulling patient data. Someone had set up the infrastructure to pull patient data. Whether it had been successfully used is still being determined. He folded his hands on the table. "The installation appears recent, approximately 2 to 3 weeks, based on the adhesive condition and dust pattern." 2 to 3 weeks. She'd been working with Rook for 8 days. He'd been at Harbor Ridge for 6 weeks. That meant the device was installed roughly 3 weeks after Rook arrived, after he had already demonstrated behavioral issues that were making the kennel staff want him out of the annex, and therefore keeping him close to the HVAC access wall, where he could alert on exactly this kind of intrusion. She said none of this out loud. Decker was clearly already running the same calculation. "I need to ask you about Carter," he said. "I didn't know him, only by reputation. But you recognize the hand signal Rook responded to as originating from Carter's unit, from the operational culture of that unit. That particular adaptation, the recall variant, I learned from a handler named Warren who'd worked in the same deployment theater. It's not published. It moves through personal contact." "Warren is still active?" "I don't know. I haven't been in contact with anyone from those rotations in over 3 years." Decker made another note. "Carter's status was upgraded 2 days ago," he said. Status unresolved has been reclassified to active recovery operation. She kept her face still. He's alive. That is not confirmed information I'm able to share with you. Which meant yes. She didn't go back to Ward 7. Osei, to her credit, had already arranged shift coverage without being asked. A text came through while Maya was still in the coordination room. Your patients are covered. Stay available. Brief, useful, no drama. She filed it in the growing list of reasons she was glad Osei was the person in this building she'd chosen to bring into it. The IG team worked quickly. By 10 o'clock, there were 6 of them on site, and 2 had settled in the administrative wing with laptops and expressions that communicated a complete indifference to the feelings of the people whose offices they were occupying. Hale's office door was closed, which was unusual for this time of day. Maya walked past it twice and heard nothing the first time and muted tense phone conversation the second. She went to the annex. Rook was calm in the way he got calm after a period of high focus. Not relaxed exactly, but settled. The tension moved through him and discharged. He was lying in the center of his run with his head up, tracking her across the room as she approached. She sat outside his run and didn't go in. She wasn't sure why. Maybe just because she needed to be still for a few minutes without being observed by anyone who was going to write down what they saw. They said Carter might be alive, she told him quietly. His ears moved. I don't know what that means for you yet. She leaned her back against the kennel frame. But I thought you should know I'm working on it. Torres appeared in the annex door behind her. She heard his footsteps stop. He stood there for a moment and then came and sat on a supply crate a few feet away, which was about as close as Torres ever got to something that could be characterized as a dramatic gesture. The IG team is asking for Rook's complete file, he said. All of it, including the evaluation documentation Hale's office generated. Good. The evaluation was written by a Captain Soren from Garrison's behavioral unit. He came in for one session, 45 minutes. Torres paused. He documented 2 aggressive incidents and recommended permanent restriction. She turned to look at him. He was here for 45 minutes. I was there. He entered the run without establishing any kind of contact protocol, went direct approach, got a defensive response, and wrote it up as unprovoked aggression. He said it flatly, without apparent emotion, which she recognized as the version of anger that Torres expressed when he felt it most. Was that documented anywhere besides his report? I filed an observation note. I wasn't sure it would go anywhere. It goes somewhere now, she said. Give it to Decker. Already sent it over. She looked back at Rook. He was watching the door now, not her, ears forward, the focused attention that meant he was tracking something she couldn't hear yet. Then she heard it. Footsteps in the administrative corridor. More than one person. Moving with purpose. The annex door opened and Decker came in, followed by a woman in uniform Maya hadn't seen before. Full colonel's insignia, Judge Advocate General's Corps branch insignia on her lapel. Behind them, Hale. He looked wrong. Not in the sense that anything about his physical appearance had changed, but in the particular way that men who are accustomed to controlling the composition of a room look. When they walk into one, they don't control. His eyes moved to Maya and stayed there for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, somewhere between calculation and something colder. Ms. Whitmore, the JAG colonel said. Her nameplate read Ashby. I'm told you have first-hand observations relevant to this investigation. We need you in the main conference room. All right? Now, if possible. Yes? She stood, and as she did, she glanced back at Rook. He had turned from the door and was looking directly at her, just watching, waiting to see what she did next. She went. The conference room had been rearranged. The 2 low chairs were still there, but the table had been cleared of the usual facility management paperwork and replaced with laptops, printed documents, and a recording setup that made the one in the coordination room look informal. Decker was at one end. Ashby was at the head. 2 other people, both in civilian clothes, both with the specific kind of stillness that came from spending years in rooms where being still was a professional requirement, were against the wall. Hale was at the far end of the table, and he was not in control of this room. That was visible in everything: the position of his chair, the angle of his body, the fact that he had a legal representative sitting beside him who was currently saying something very quiet directly into his ear. Maya sat where Decker indicated. Ashby opened without preamble. Ms. Whitmore, for the record, you are here as a witness to events relevant to an active Inspector General investigation into potential obstruction, unauthorized facility access by an unknown third party, and possible command-level misconduct at Harbor Ridge Veterans Medical Center. You are not under investigation. You may have legal representation present if you choose. Do you understand? Yes. Do you wish to have representation present? No. Ashby looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a lawyer who had heard that answer before and knew it was almost never the optimal choice, but had stopped fighting it. All right, let's talk about what you heard 2 nights ago. She walked them through it again, cleaner this time, more formal, with the awareness that this version was going into a record that would be read by people she'd never meet. She was precise about language. She quoted Hale as close to verbatim as she could and said so clearly, "This is close to verbatim, not exact." She noted the time, the location, the other voice she hadn't been able to identify. When she described the words "creates exposure," Hale's legal representative leaned forward slightly. Hale himself didn't move. Ashby asked, "When he said exposure, did you interpret that as meaning reputational risk, legal risk, or something else?" "Operational," she said. Given the context of the conversation, references to flagged paperwork, Carter's case, I interpreted it as concern about information connected to a classified operation becoming visible through the investigation of Rook's behavioral status. And what did you do with that interpretation? I documented it immediately afterward and reported it to Dr. Osai the following morning. You didn't report it to Colonel Hale. He was the subject of what I'd heard. Ashby made a note. Hale's representative spoke for the first time. Colonel Hale disputes that any such conversation took place. Flat, procedural. The kind of statement that was less a claim and more a marker being placed on a map. Maya looked at him. He can dispute it, she said. The annex has a security camera. It covers the exterior corridor and the door I was standing near. The timestamp and location of any audio captured there would establish my position. The representative's expression didn't change, but something in the quality of his stillness shifted. Decker leaned forward slightly. The security footage from that corridor is part of our current evidence review, he said, which was information he was choosing to release into this room at this specific moment, and everyone in the room understood that. Hale said nothing. He'd been saying nothing for most of this meeting, and the quality of his silence had gone from controlled to something that had more effort in it. Ashby moved on. She walked Maya through the operational file information Navarro had shared, through the behavioral assessment discrepancies Torres had documented, through the specific sequence of Rook's alert behavior that morning, and how Maya had responded to it. She was thorough and unhurried, and Maya matched her pace. This was not a conversation where she needed to push. The structure of it was already going somewhere. She just needed to stay in it clearly. An hour and 14 minutes into the session, one of the civilian figures against the wall spoke for the first time. He addressed Decker directly, not the room. The relay device. Forensics came back on the installation hardware. He set a single printed page on the table and slid it toward Decker. Purchase trail goes back 16 months. 16 months. That was not a recent operation. That was something that had been planned long before the current situation, long before Maya had ever heard of Rook or Carter, long before Hale had started requesting discharge paperwork. She looked at Hale. He was looking at the page on the table. And for the first time since she'd walked into this room, he looked like a man who understood exactly how far the ground had shifted under him. Ashby gathered the papers in front of her with the quiet deliberateness of someone who was ending one phase and moving to another. Ms. Whitmore, you're free to go for now. We'll need you back this afternoon, likely around 3 o'clock. Do not discuss the content of this session with other staff members. Maya stood. She picked up her coffee cup, which had been there the whole time and was now cold, and she didn't drink it. She just needed something to do with her hands. She was at the door when Hale spoke. He hadn't said a single word during the entire session. When he did speak, it was not to his lawyer and not to Ashby. It was to her. You've been here 4 years, he said. Good record, no complaints. She turned. You understand that whatever you think you've seen, he said, the picture is more complicated than a dog and a nurse. She looked at him for a moment. He was not threatening her. She understood that clearly. He was something else, almost in a way she found more disturbing, attempting to communicate with her as a peer, as if they were two people who understood institutional complexity in the same way and might be able to arrive at a mutual understanding about the appropriate scope of things. "I'm sure it is complicated," she said. "That's exactly why I reported what I heard." She left before he could respond. He sat. In the hallway, she stopped and stood still for a moment, one hand against the wall. Her heart was moving faster than she'd let show in the room, not from fear, from the specific adrenaline of a situation that had escalated past the point where individual decisions could slow it down. This was moving now. It had its own momentum, and she was part of it, and there was no clean exit that left the important things intact. She went back to the annex. She ran Rook's afternoon session at 1 o'clock, an hour ahead of schedule, because she needed the reset and suspected he did too. She kept it simple. Basic command language, the familiar rhythms he'd been building to over the past week. He responded with the kind of steadiness that she'd started to expect from him. Not perfect, not textbook, but real. He hesitated on the second directional cue, and she waited him out and he completed it. He overran a position signal, and she reset him without reaction, and he got it the second time. Small things, important things. By the time she went back in for the 3 o'clock session, Torres had told her 3 things in passing that together formed a picture she wasn't sure she was ready for. That 2 of Hale's administrative staff had been escorted from the building by IG personnel shortly after noon. That the legal representative had been seen leaving the facility at 2:15, and that Captain Soren, the behavioral assessor who'd written Rook's evaluation, had received a phone call from Decker's team that morning. She sat in the conference room at 3 o'clock and Ashby said, "We've obtained Rook's full operational record from the classified level. I want to go through it with you because you may be able to help us interpret what we're reading in terms of behavioral indicators." The file was 83 pages. She wasn't going to read all of it in this room, but Ashby walked her through the relevant sections. Rook and Carter had been working together for 4 years, longer than the average MWD handler partnership by about 18 months. The bond that length of time built was documented in the performance assessments in the language that military records used for such things: above-average coordination, handler-animal communication, rated exceptional, operational performance consistent across high-stress environments. Translation: they were genuinely good together, the kind of partnership that took years to build and couldn't be transferred. The final operation they'd been deployed on together, the facility security assessment that Navarro had referenced obliquely, had involved embedded surveillance detection inside an installation with suspected insider threat activity. Carter had been part of a 3-person team. Rook had been his working partner. Ashby set the file down and looked at her. Carter's team was inside the target installation when someone triggered a lockdown. 2 team members exfiltrated. Carter didn't. She paused. Rook was found outside the installation perimeter 4 hours later, alone. Maya was quiet for a moment. She thought about a dog waiting outside a building for 4 hours. She thought about what he'd been waiting for. "He didn't leave him," she said. "No. According to the exfil report, Carter ordered the other 2 out when the lockdown triggered. Rook was outside the perimeter on patrol. He never went back in. Carter ordered the other 2 out. That was the kind of decision that took a fraction of a second and the rest of your life to reckon with." "The installation involved," Ashby said carefully, "had data infrastructure similar in configuration to what we found accessed through the device in your annex corridor." Maya stared at her. "We believe," Ashby continued, "that whoever placed that device may have a connection to the operation where Carter disappeared. And we believe Rook alerted on that device not because he detected foreign hardware, but because he detected a scent profile." "A person," Maya said. "A person who may have been at the original installation, someone Rook has been trained to track." Ashby folded her hands on the table. "Which means whoever placed that device may not know that the dog who just alerted on their work is the same dog who was on site when they conducted the original operation." The room was very quiet. "They're going to come back," Maya said. It wasn't a question. "We believe they already have," Ashby said. "Twice in the past 10 days, according to exterior camera footage we've now reviewed. The device wasn't their endpoint, It was infrastructure for something larger. Maya sat with that for a moment. Outside, the late afternoon was going orange through the conference room windows, the desert light doing what it did at this hour, flattening everything, making distances harder to judge. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Ashby opened the file again to a page near the back. On it was a photograph. A man Maya didn't recognize, 40s, civilian clothing, captured at an angle that suggested a camera he hadn't been aware of. "We need Rook to confirm a scent identification. We need to run it correctly, with someone he'll actually work with." Ashby looked up. "That's you." Maya looked at the photograph. She looked at the window. She thought about Rook and his run, lying with his head up, watching the door, still doing the only job he knew how to do. She thought about Carter ordering his team out of a building and not coming out himself. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning," Ashby said. "Oh, 600. She nodded once. She was almost out of the room when Decker said, quietly, from his seat, without looking up from his notes, "Whitmore, the security footage from the corridor." She stopped. Hale's conversation. It was captured. He still wasn't looking at her. "Clear audio, 41 seconds. She stood there for a moment, letting that land. Then she walked out, and she was 3 steps down the hall before she registered that her hands had finally stopped shaking. She didn't sleep again, but this time it was different. The first sleepless night had been the anxious kind, the kind where your mind runs scenarios you can't control. This one was operational. She lay in the dark and ran through what she knew about scent identification work, the protocols, the variables, the ways it could go wrong, and by 4 in the morning she had a session structure in her head that she was reasonably confident in, with 3 contingency adjustments built in for the ways Rook might not cooperate. She was at Harbor Ridge by 5:15. The facility was different at this hour, not quiet exactly, hospitals were never quiet, but the particular activity visible was the kind that belonged to the building itself, rather than to the investigation that had taken it over. Night nurses finishing charts, maintenance running floor wax on the administrative corridor, the smell of the first coffee from the break room 2 hallways down. She changed into scrubs in the locker room and went to the annex. Rook heard her coming. By the time she pushed through the kennel door, he was already at the front of his run, ears forward, the alert attention that was his version of a greeting. Not the desperate attention of a dog who'd been isolated too long. Something more measured. He'd learned over the past week to trust that she came back, which was not a small thing for an animal in his situation. She sat outside the run for 20 minutes and didn't try to do anything. Just let him read her, settle into her presence, understand that this morning was different in some ways and the same in the ones that mattered. At 5:50, Decker arrived with 2 people she hadn't met, a woman introduced only as Voss, who carried a sealed evidence container, and a man named Garrett, who had the specific build and movement pattern of someone with extensive field experience and absolutely no interest in discussing it. Ashby wasn't there. This part of the operation had a different composition. "We're going to need you to run this without briefing him on the target," Decker said. "Standard double-blind structure. You'll handle the commands, Garrett will observe, Voss will manage the scent samples. You don't look at the samples, you give the commands. Whatever he indicates, we document." "Understood." She paused. "How many samples?" 6, Voss said. 1 target, 5 controls, all applied to the same type of material at the same time. Clean protocol. She nodded. Clean protocol was right. It meant the result would hold if it went anywhere legally, which apparently it might. "Give me 2 minutes with him before we start." Decker gestured. "Go ahead." She went into the run alone. Rook moved toward her immediately, not anxious, just attentive. She crouched and let him read her hands, her clothes, the way she was breathing. She used the ready signal, which was not a command but a preparation, something Carter's unit had apparently built into their protocol to shift the dog's attention from ambient to focused without ramping his stress. She'd started using it 3 days ago, and he'd clicked onto it quickly. His posture changed, not tense, focused, the way he looked when he was working. "Okay," she said, to him and also to herself. The session took 38 minutes, and it was not clean. That was the first thing she'd tell anyone who asked. It was not clean because real things never were. Rook missed the first pass entirely, walked the line of samples with his nose working, and then circled back to the start and stood there, which could mean indecision or could mean none of the current samples were the target. She reset him with the ready signal and they went again. On the second pass, he slowed at sample 4. Not an alert, a hesitation, the kind that in a human you'd call a double take. He moved on, completed the line, came back to 4, and sat. Full alert, clean and definitive. Voss noted it without expression. Garrett noted it. Decker, standing outside the run, made a mark on his clipboard. She brought Rook out of the work with the same structured cool-down she'd been building into their sessions. It took longer than the alert itself because she needed him to understand the work was done and he'd done it correctly. That part mattered. Not for the record, for him. When she came out of the run, Decker said, "Sample 4." That's what he indicated. He looked at Garrett. Garrett nodded once. "Sample 4," Decker said quietly, "is a scent profile collected from the access corridor adjacent to the HVAC breach, substrate from inside the duct housing." He paused. "It matches a profile in our database connected to a person of interest in the operation where Carter went missing." She stood with that for a moment. Rook had just identified, by scent alone and after 4 months and whatever had happened to him in between, the person connected to what had happened to his handler. She thought about what that meant about the quality of that dog's memory. And then she stopped thinking about it because it was going to take her somewhere she couldn't afford to go right now. "What happens next?" she asked. "We were already moving on this individual. What Rook gave us this morning changes the evidentiary weight of the operation significantly." Decker looked at her steadily. "It also changes the picture on Hale." "How?" "The purchase trail on the relay device goes back 16 months. Hale's been in this command position for 14 months. The installation timeline means the device planning predated his arrival. But his response to Rook's presence here, his push to have the dog removed before the assessment window closed, his conversation in this corridor." He paused. "We're now looking at whether he was aware of the device and actively managing the situation to protect it, or whether he had a separate and unrelated reason to want Rook gone." "Meaning he might be dirty, or he might just be negligent," she said. "Meaning the investigation is broader than we initially assessed." He said it without apology. "Either way, your documentation of what you heard is part of a formal record now." She went to find Torres. Quote, "He was in the vet office with 3 case files open and the particular expression of someone who had been awake too long and was now running on professional obligation. He looked up when she came in and said nothing, which was his way of asking how it went. He identified," she said. Torres closed the file he was looking at. He was quiet for a moment. "And the evaluation?" "I don't know the official outcome yet, but the investigation team has the full operational record now, and they have Torres's observation note, and they have the session documentation from the past week." She sat in the chair across from him. "Soren's assessment is going to be reviewed." "Reviewed as in reconsidered, or reviewed as in formally challenged?" "Both, I think." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. It had been empty for what looked like a long time. "You know what the worst part was?" he said. It wasn't really a question. Soren was in and out in 45 minutes, and his report read like a thorough evaluation. All the right language, all the right structure. Anyone who didn't know what they were looking at would have thought it was solid work. "That's how those things work," she said. "You use the form to make the absence of substance invisible." "I should have escalated earlier." "You filed a note." "That's not the same thing." She looked at him. He wasn't wrong, and they both knew it, and she wasn't going to tell him he was wrong because he didn't need absolution. He needed to remember this the next time there was a note to file or a meeting to push for. "No," she said. "It's not. But it's what you had, and it's what went into the record, and it's part of what we built this on. So." He nodded. Not relieved, just accepting, which was more honest. Her pager went off at 9:47, not Ward 7. The administrative extension, Osei's office. When she got there, Osei was not alone. Ashby was in the chair across from the desk, and beside her was a man Maya hadn't seen before in civilian clothes, with a military bearing so deeply embedded it had survived the suit. Short gray hair, posture like something load-bearing, the particular stillness of someone very senior who had learned to let rooms come to him. Osei said, "Maya, this is General Whitfield. He's the oversight authority for the IG investigation at this facility." Whitfield looked at her with the calm, comprehensive attention of someone who had read a file about her before she walked in. "Nurse Whitmore, sit down." She sat. "I've been briefed on this morning's session outcome," he said, "and on your role in identifying the behavioral situation with the animal, the anomaly in the assessment record, and the corridor conversation." He paused. "I've also reviewed your service record, the full version, not the summary." She kept her face still. "All right. You served 2 deployments, embedded with combat units in a medical support role with significant field responsibilities beyond standard medic protocol." He wasn't asking. "You have direct experience with MWD unit operations in 2 theaters. You chose not to foreground that when you joined this facility. It wasn't relevant to my nursing role. It became relevant." "Yes." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "Colonel Hale has been formally suspended pending investigation as of 8 o'clock this morning," he said. "His administrative authority at this facility has been transferred to a temporary command structure under the IG office until the investigation is resolved. He is not permitted on the premises." She hadn't expected it to feel like anything specific. She'd known it was coming. The audio footage, the purchase trail, the sequence of documented decisions had made it essentially inevitable once the IG team had what they needed. But hearing it stated plainly, in this room, with that particular finality, made something in her chest settle that she hadn't known was still braced. "The investigation's secondary scope," Ashby said, "involves reviewing every administrative decision Hale made during his 14-month command tenure that touched either operational security, MWD management, or personnel evaluations in which external review was available and not utilized." "How many decisions are we talking about?" Osei asked. 47 identified so far." Ashby's voice was as neutral as numbers. "We'll know more by end of week." Whitfield looked back at Maya. "The behavioral evaluation conducted by Captain Soren has been formally withdrawn from the record. The IG office will be requesting a new evaluation through proper channels, conducted by personnel without prior association with Hale's command structure." He paused. "I understand you have 6 days of documented session work with the animal." "I do." "That documentation will be submitted as part of the formal case file for his rehabilitation status review. It will not determine the outcome, that's a separate process, but it will be part of the evidentiary record." "Understood." She paused. "What about Carter?" The room was quiet for a moment. Whitfield and Ashby exchanged a brief look, the kind that communicated something about what could be shared and what couldn't, and where the line was. "Sergeant Carter's recovery operation is active," Whitfield said. "I can tell you that his status changed significantly in the last 48 hours. I cannot tell you more than that." It wasn't enough, and it was more than nothing. She filed it in the same place she'd filed Decker's non-answer 2 days ago and moved on. "One more thing," Whitfield said. He reached into the folder in front of him and slid a single sheet across Osei's desk toward her. "This is a formal letter of commendation from the IG office, entered into your personnel file, for the documentation work, the observation record, and the decision to report what you heard through appropriate channels rather than," he paused, "other options." She looked at the paper. It was brief and official and used the correct formal language for these things. She read it once and set it back on the desk. "Thank you," she said. She meant it simply, not with the complicated feeling she might have expected. Just, thank you. 1. The afternoon moved differently after that. The facility had the quality of a place where the weather had changed, not the storm itself, but the stillness after it, when the air is cleaner than it was, and everything looks slightly different under the new light. She ran an afternoon session with Rook at 2 o'clock, and it was the best one they'd had. Not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing dramatic happened. He was focused and present and responsive in the easy way that animals are when the pressure has come down to a level they can work within. She ran him through the full command sequence she'd built over the week. He completed it without significant hesitation. He made one mistake on a position hold, overshot by about 2 feet, and she reset him and he corrected. She sat on the floor of his run afterward and he lay 3 feet away, and she thought about the fact that 6 weeks ago, this dog had been scheduled for removal by a man who'd needed him gone and had used the behavioral record as the mechanism. And Rook had just been waiting, doing the only thing he knew to do, alerting on the thing that had destroyed his world the first time in the only language he had. Torres appeared in the doorway at 2:45. "You have visitors," he said, with an expression she couldn't quite parse. She came out of the run and followed him to the coordination hallway. 3 people were waiting. She recognized 2 of them from the past 3 days, Garrett and one of the IG administrative staff. The third was a woman in hospital administration clothing who Maya had seen in Hale's orbit before, one of the 2 people who had, over the past 3 weeks, made it quietly but clearly known that Maya's involvement in the kennel situation was outside her scope and not particularly welcome. Her name was Holt, Deputy Administrative Director. Holt's expression was the particular one that people wear when they are doing something they have decided is professionally necessary and would prefer to have behind them as quickly as possible. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "I've been asked to communicate on behalf of the administrative team," a pause that had been constructed to carry weight. "The staff feedback submitted regarding your involvement with the K9 program, the concerns about scope of practice and appropriate role boundaries, has been reviewed and formally withdrawn from your personnel record." Maya looked at her. "Additionally," Holt continued, "the administrative team would like to express that the concerns were not reflective of a full understanding of the situation. It was not an apology. It was the shape of one, carefully constructed to communicate regret without accepting specific responsibility." Maya recognized it because she'd heard that particular construction before, in different settings, from different people, and she'd long since stopped expecting anything else. "Noted," she said. "We hope," Holt started. "I appreciate you telling me," Maya said. "Is there anything else?" There wasn't. Holt left. Garrett stayed and he said, "The individual identified through the scent session this morning was taken into custody at 14:20 hours at a residential address 11 miles from this facility." She turned to look at him. "He had equipment in the residence consistent with a second-phase data extraction operation. They found it before he could clear it." He said it without satisfaction, which she respected. "Whatever he was building toward here, it didn't get built." She leaned against the corridor wall and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Does Decker know about Rook's connection to Carter's operation? The specific details from the file Ashby walked me through?" "Decker wrote that file section." Garrett looked at her with a slight adjustment in his expression, something that wasn't quite a smile. "He's been on this case for 4 months. Rook was the piece he couldn't get to work. Until you." She absorbed that. 4 months. Decker had been building this from the other direction, starting with Carter's disappearance, working toward the device, toward the person, toward Harbor Ridge, and the thing blocking the final piece of the case had been a traumatized dog in a kennel that nobody knew how to reach. "The review board," she said. "For Rook's status. When does that convene?" "Formal request goes in Friday. Board will convene within 2 weeks, standard timeline." He looked at her. "Your documentation is strong. The withdrawn evaluation removes the main counterargument. The active alert this morning is documented by 3 witnesses, including 2 IG personnel." He paused. "He's not going back on the danger list." She let herself believe that for a moment, just a moment, because she'd learned not to spend too long in a version of events that hadn't fully happened yet. "One thing I need to tell you," Garrett said. His voice shifted slightly, not warmer, but more careful. "Carter's team recovered him at 0300 this morning. He's in medical now, not at this facility." She was very still. "He's alive," Garrett said. "Significant injuries. They don't know yet what the recovery timeline looks like, but alive." She looked at the corridor wall for a moment, at the generic institutional paint and the corkboard with its facility notices, and the light fixture that had been flickering for 3 days, and apparently nobody had fixed it yet. "Does Rook know?" she asked. It was not a logical question. She knew it wasn't a logical question. "No," Garrett said. gently, which she hadn't expected from him. She nodded. She went back to the annex. Sat. She didn't tell Rook. She sat inside his run and let him lie against her leg, which he'd started doing 2 days ago and which she'd allowed because there was no clinical reason not to, and because there were some things that were just true, regardless of what the protocol said. She sat there until the light in the annex windows went the late afternoon orange it went, and she thought about a man in a medical facility somewhere she didn't know, injured but alive, who had ordered his team out of a building and not followed, and whose dog had spent 4 months alerting on the scent of the person responsible and waiting for someone to understand why. She thought about what she was going to put in the final session report. She thought about the words she would use that were accurate and clinical and would also somehow carry what the past 8 days had actually been. She didn't have them yet. She'd find them. At 5:30, Torres knocked on the kennel frame. IG team wants you in the conference room at 6. Final witness deposition for today. All right. She stood. Rook stood with her. She gave him the settle signal and he lay back down, watching her. She pulled the run door closed. She was at the annex exit when Torres said quietly, "The review board paperwork. For Rook's status. Whoever submits the formal behavioral rehabilitation recommendation, it carries the most weight." She looked back at him. "Osei told me," he said. "She thinks it should come from you. I think so too." He shrugged. "Just so you know." She held the door for a moment. "Put it in writing and send it to Ashby's office, with both our names on it." He nodded. She let the door close. She was halfway down the administrative corridor when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, but a prefix she recognized from a very specific context. A military hospital exchange she hadn't seen in years. She stopped walking. She looked at the screen for 3 full seconds. Then she answered. The voice on the other end was hoarse. Not weak. Hoarse in the way that voices get when someone has been through significant physical stress and is now on the other side of it, finding out what's still working. "Is this Whitmore?" the man said. "Yes." A pause. She could hear the ambient sounds of a medical environment behind him, the soft mechanical rhythm of monitoring equipment, a PA system in the distance. "This is Carter. Elias Carter." She stood in the middle of the administrative corridor and said nothing for a moment. "They told me," he said, "that someone ran a scent session with Rook this morning, that he made a positive ID." Another pause. "They said it was a nurse." "That's right. They said you've been working with him for 8 days. 9, as of today." She heard him exhale. It was not a clean sound. There was effort in it, and something else. The specific quality of relief that people express when they've been carrying something so heavy for so long that putting it down doesn't feel like a release so much as a collapse. "How is he?" She leaned against the corridor wall. Down the hall, someone from the IG administrative team was coming out of the conference room with a folder, and she held up one finger. "Give me a minute." He nodded and went back in. "He's better than he was," she said. "He had a rough few weeks, but he's been doing good work, today especially." He identified? Clear and definitive, second pass, no hesitation. Carter was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was slightly different, controlled in the way that people who are trying not to show something control themselves when they're not quite strong enough to hide it. I didn't know what they'd done to him after." "He's intact," she said. "Everything that mattered, he kept." She heard him exhale again, slower this time. "He's going to need a handler," she said, "when you're recovered. The review board is convening in 2 weeks. The documentation is solid. He's coming off the danger list. They told me the timeline on recovery is..." He stopped. "It's not short." "I know. I don't know what that means for him yet. If he can wait, or if they'll reassign..." "He's been waiting 4 months," she said. "He's good at it." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. She had never spoken to this man before in her life, but they had enough shared language, the specific fluency of people who had worked in the same kind of conditions, made the same kind of calculations, understood the particular weight of the bond between a handler and a working animal, that the silence wasn't empty. "Thank you," Carter said. It was simple and direct, and it landed that way. "Do your physical therapy," she said. "All of it. Don't cut corners because you think you're ready. A sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, interrupted by what was clearly a very uncomfortable rib situation. Copy that. She hung up and stood in the corridor for another 10 seconds, and then she went into the conference room and gave her final deposition. The formal review board convened on a Thursday, 11 days later. Maya wasn't on the board. She was a submitting witness, which meant she'd filed her documentation and could attend as an observer, but had no vote. She sat in the back row with Torres beside her, and Osei in the row ahead, and she kept her hand still in her lap and watched the process work. The board was 3 people: a veterinary behaviorist from the DoD's Working Animal Program, a JAG officer, and a senior handler from Garrison Prescott, who had not been part of Hale's operational chain. They reviewed the submitted documentation in order: Soren's withdrawn evaluation, Torres's observation note, Maya's 9 daily session reports, the footage from that morning in the annex, the IG witnessed scent identification, the full operational record from Carter's unit, now declassified to the level relevant to Rook's case. The veterinary behaviorist asked 3 questions, all of them technical, all directed at the submitted record rather than at the room. The Garrison handler asked 1 question about the specific field-adapted hand signals and where Maya had learned them, and she answered it plainly. The deliberation took 22 minutes. Rook was formally removed from the danger list. His behavioral evaluation was reclassified from compromised, restricted access to trauma-adaptive, active rehabilitation. His status was updated to retired military working dog, protected placement, pending handler reunion protocol. The last part had been Osei's addition. She'd submitted the language herself 2 days before the board, and nobody had removed it. Torres made a sound beside Maya that she pretended not to hear. She looked at the front of the room and felt something that she didn't immediately have a name for. Not triumph. That wasn't quite right. Something quieter. The particular satisfaction of a thing that should have been true finally being made official. A gap between reality and the record closed. Hale's situation took longer because these things always did. The IG investigation completed its primary phase 6 weeks after the board hearing. The findings were not released publicly in their full form, classified material involved, operational security concerns, but the administrative outcomes were. Colonel Victor Hale was formally relieved of command. He was not court-martialed, which Maya had known was unlikely. The evidence connected him to deliberate obstruction of the Rook evaluation and to prior knowledge of the device's existence. But the line between knew and protected it, and knew and made his own separate calculation about managing exposure was evidently difficult enough to establish in court that the JAG team had made a different recommendation. He faced an Article 32 hearing instead. Reduction in rank was recommended. He would lose his command position permanently. It was not what she would have chosen. She'd known enough about how these processes worked to know that it rarely was. The thing you wanted was the thing you asked for anyway, and then you watched what the process actually produced, and you decided what you could do with that. What the process produced was his command authority, gone. His position at Harbor Ridge, gone. His ability to make another unilateral decision about a dog or a case or a person without oversight, structurally removed. Captain Soren's behavioral evaluation record was flagged for review. He was required to complete a supervised reassessment course through the DoD's Working Animal Program. His commanding officer's directive, not the IG's, but it had come in response to the IG's findings. His evaluation of Rook had, according to the formal language of the review board's finding, failed to meet minimum standards for professional assessment and demonstrated a significant deficit in both protocol adherence and behavioral science application. Holt, the deputy administrative director who had been part of the quiet campaign to limit Maya's involvement, was not investigated because she hadn't done anything that constituted misconduct in the formal sense. She had made professional judgments that turned out to be wrong, and had made them in an environment where the person above her was managing the situation badly. The line between complicit and misinformed was real, even when it was uncomfortable. Maya didn't feel good about that, but she didn't feel the need to feel good about it either. It was what it was. What she felt was this: the record was clear now. And the record was what remained after everyone's feelings about the situation had finished mattering. Tut. 3 weeks after the board hearing, Osei called her into the office and set a folder on the desk. DoD Military Rehabilitation Advisory Program, Osei said. They're building a consultation network for facilities that manage veterans with PTSD-adjacent trauma profiles, both human patients and MWDs. They want clinical people who have direct experience with both populations. She pushed the folder toward Maya. They asked for a recommendation from the IG team. Decker recommended you. Maya looked at the folder. She didn't open it yet. What would it involve? Part-time advisory role. You'd keep your position here. They're not asking you to leave. They want you on a rotating consultation basis, 6 facilities in the program. You'd help design assessment protocols, consult on complicated cases, train staff in trauma-adaptive approaches. Osei paused. The kind of thing you've been doing here informally, except with structure and resources behind it. Rook's session documentation, Maya said. That's part of what they're building on? You and Torres both. Osei folded her hands on the desk. Torres is being asked to consult on the veterinary side, you on the clinical nursing and behavioral side. She paused. It's a good thing, Maya. You built something here that they want to replicate. Maya opened the folder. It was thorough. Program structure, facility list, time commitment, compensation. She read the first 2 pages and then looked up. I want to finish Rook's rehabilitation first, she said, before I take on other cases. That's explicitly built into the start date. Osei almost smiled. I may have specified that condition when I was asked for my input. Maya closed the folder. Thank you, Patricia. Osei shook her head slightly. Don't thank me for something I did because it was right. Carter arrived at Harbor Ridge 7 weeks after the board hearing. He came through the main entrance on a Tuesday morning with a military escort and a cane he was using with the practiced frustration of someone who had accepted it was necessary and hadn't stopped resenting it. He was thinner than his service photo and walked with a compensation pattern on his left side that told her something about where the significant damage had been. His face showed the specific kind of weathering that came from an extended period of poor conditions, followed by a longer period of difficult recovery. He looked like someone who had been through something serious and had come out of it not unscathed but upright, which was the most you could ask. She met him in the main corridor. They shook hands because there was no more appropriate gesture between 2 people who were, essentially, strangers with a significant amount of shared context. You look better than you sounded on the phone, she said. That's a low bar, he said. It is. She paused. Ready? He looked at the cane in his hand, at the corridor ahead of him, at her. No, he said. Let's go anyway. She walked him to the annex. She'd thought about this moment more than she'd planned to, specifically about what Rook's response might be, and what Carter's response to Rook's response might be, and what she would do if either of those things went wrong. The reunion protocols for Handler and MWD were not standardized. There wasn't a clean clinical playbook for a working dog who had spent 4 months in a specific kind of not knowing. She'd read everything she could find and made decisions based on what she'd learned about this specific animal over the past 2 months. She kept it simple. She went into the annex first and signaled Rook to a sit position about 10 feet from the kennel door. He complied, attentive, reading the unfamiliar energy in the room. She'd told him nothing, obviously, but dogs read information that isn't communicated in words, and something had clearly changed in the atmosphere. She opened the annex door. Carter came through and stopped just inside the threshold. Rook saw him. What happened next was not dramatic, and somehow that was the most devastating thing about it. Rook didn't lunge, didn't bark, didn't perform the kind of exuberant reunion that would have been easier to watch because it would have had somewhere for the emotion to go. He made one sound, low, involuntary, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than decision, and then he moved. Not fast, not frantic. He crossed the distance between them and pressed himself against Carter's leg with his full weight, head down, and stayed there. Carter put his hand on the dog's head and stood very still. Maya looked at the annex wall, gave them 30 seconds that felt like much longer. When she looked back, Carter's jaw was tight in the specific way that it gets when someone is working very hard on something. His free hand was on Rook's neck, fingers in the scruff, and Rook hadn't moved. Just pressed there. Solid and present, and finally, after 4 months and however many miles and everything in between, certain of where he was. She went and stood near the supply shelf and pretended to check something in her pocket and didn't look at either of them for another full minute. Carter's recovery timeline was real, not short, as he'd said on the phone. He wasn't cleared for full duty and wouldn't be for another several months at minimum. The path back to active handler work was longer than either of them probably acknowledged out loud. But he came to Harbor Ridge 3 times a week for physical therapy, and on 2 of those days he spent time in the annex with Rook, rebuilding the operational relationship the same slow way that Maya had built trust with the dog in the first place, through presence, through patience, through the repeated demonstration that the world still had a language they both knew. She watched that process from a respectful distance. Her work with Rook was transitioning, not ending. She still ran maintenance sessions on the days Carter wasn't there, still filed the documentation for the advisory program, still sat in the annex on quiet afternoons when her ward was covered, and she needed to think. But the center of gravity had shifted back to where it belonged. Rook had a handler. The handler was working to come back. The small, imperfect miracle of that was not lost on her. The commendation ceremony was not her idea, and she would not have requested it. It was Whitfield's initiative, conducted in the facility's main meeting room on a Friday afternoon with about 40 people present. A mix of hospital staff, IG personnel, garrison representatives, and 2 individuals in civilian clothes whose affiliation she didn't ask about. Whitfield read the formal language of the commendation, which was precise and correct, and used the appropriate terminology for what had been documented. He presented a framed certificate and a letter that would go into her permanent file. He shook her hand. A few people clapped. What she remembered afterward was not the ceremony itself, but what happened outside it. Walsh, the security officer who had initially dismissed her concern about the HVAC corridor and told her there was nobody in the access space, was waiting in the hallway when she came out. He looked uncomfortable in the specific way of someone who has rehearsed something and is now finding that the rehearsal doesn't quite match the actual moment. "I should have checked the corridor when you first said to," he said. She looked at him. "Yes. I'm not—" He stopped. "I wanted to say that." "I know." She paused. "And now you know what it looks like when someone's telling you something and you need to listen. So." He nodded. She moved on. She found Torres by the coffee station at the back of the room, and he handed her a cup without being asked, and they stood together for a moment in the particular comfortable silence of people who have been through something difficult alongside each other and don't need to perform a feeling about it. "The Portland facility," he said. "First consultation, next month." "You ready?" "Absolutely not." He sipped his coffee. "Should be interesting." She smiled, which was genuine and also tired, because the past 2 months had been the kind of exhausting that didn't fully resolve just because the situation did. She'd sleep better eventually. She was already sleeping better than she had in the first week, which was progress. She went to the annex one more time that evening, after the ceremony, after the staff had drifted back to their wards and offices, and the building had settled into its evening rhythm. Rook was lying in the center of his run with his head up, watching the door the way he always watched the door. His ears came forward when she appeared. She sat outside the run, didn't go in, just sat on the floor with her back against the kennel frame and her coffee going cold beside her. She thought about what it meant to spend 4 years in a place and never tell anyone the most relevant thing about who you were. She told herself it was practical, that foregrounding her military background would change how people treated her, shift the expectations in ways that didn't serve the actual work. That was true. It was also true that she'd been protecting something, some version of herself that existed outside of what she'd been in those years. The things she'd learned and the places she'd learned them, and the specific kind of damage that accumulates when you spend enough time in environments where the margin for error is measured in lives. She hadn't wanted those things to define her here. She'd wanted to be the nurse, just the nurse, what she'd learned, and it had taken a dog in a kennel and a corrupt colonel and a 4-month-long disappearance to teach it to her clearly, was that you didn't get to choose what was relevant about you when a situation needed exactly what you had. You could keep it quiet. You could store it somewhere interior and go about your days as the simplified version of yourself that was easier to explain. But the moment arrived, eventually, when the thing you'd set aside was the only thing that worked. And in that moment, the years of quiet didn't make you lesser. They made you the only person in the room who could do what needed to be done. She thought about Rook pressing himself against Carter's leg, about what it looked like when something that had been held in suspension for a very long time was finally simply allowed to resolve. Rook put his nose against the chain link. She held her hand up, flat, close to the mesh. He pressed his nose against her palm for a moment and then stepped back and lay down again, watching her with that patient, dark attention that she had come to understand was not passivity, but the deepest form of presence he knew how to offer. She stayed until the light in the annex windows went completely dark. Then she stood, picked up her cold coffee, and walked back through the building. Through the corridor she'd walked for 4 years, past the ward where her patients were sleeping, past the administrative wing where the IG team had packed up and left 2 weeks ago, past the conference room that had held so many difficult conversations in such a short amount of time. She walked out the front entrance and stood in the parking lot for a moment. The Phoenix night was still warm, the sky above the building lit orange at the edges from the city light, the mountains invisible in the dark but present. The way things are when you've looked at them long enough to know where they are, even when you can't see them. She thought about the word ordinary, the way it had been used about her, in tones that meant it as a limitation. Just a nurse, just a civilian, just a woman who had no business being in rooms where real decisions were made. She'd never been ordinary.